We begin with breaking news from Kenya, where thousands of protesters have stormed Parliament. Several people have been shot dead after police opened fire. TV footage showed the governor's office and City Hall were also burning. The riot began as Parliament deliberated a controversial tax bill that the protesters said would increase the cost of living. Lawmakers were evacuated when the building was breached. Well, DW's Kenya correspondent Edith Kimani joins me now in the studio for more. I know, Edith, you've lived in Nairobi. You're based there. You were there just a week ago. You've been following these protests from the beginning. What can you tell us about what's happening now?
This is just a culmination of a year almost of what people have been experiencing. This controversial bill that you're talking about is going to essentially set the framework for how the government collects money but also spends it. And upon closer inspection, a lot of young people found that the taxes that were being suggested just simply didn't make sense for them. As a country, the debt burden is about 68% of the total GDP, which is a lot higher than what the World Bank and the IMF suggest, which is 55%. And so the government of President Ruto is hoping that they're going to raise about $2.7 billion on increased taxes. And you can imagine that that does not look pretty on our payslips.
Remind us why these protests started in the first place. I mean, they've turned horribly violent today, but they've been all going on for quite some time. When did all this begin?
It started when the bill was tabled. There was a first reading which happened last Tuesday, which is when we saw the first wave of these protests. And the legislative process is such that today in Parliament, they were supposed to be discussing that bill for the second time. And after that, in 14 days, President Ruto would then either sign it into law or reject it. But the president has been categorical that he will sign it into law. And young people, seeing no other way out, decided to take to the streets to have their voices heard. Evidently, the members of Parliament are not listening to them, which is why it's accelerated to the pictures that we're seeing on our screens right now.
You were mentioning young people specifically feeling that they'll be affected most by this bill. Who are the people behind these protests? Are they organized? Is it spontaneous?
This is the million-dollar question. Who is behind this? It's an organic movement of young people who are frustrated. To put it into context, the continent of Europe has an average age of 42 years. In Kenya, it's 21. We're talking about 60% of the population being either millennial or Gen Z. These are the people who are most affected and who are going to continue being affected by these increased taxes. And that's why they've organized themselves in a way that's never been seen before. We're talking about nationwide protests across the country, happening also online. The movement has really just spun out of a need, and it's really, truly been organic without any real leadership.
Give us a sense of what it's like for a young person living in Kenya today, trying to find a job, get an apartment, get on with their lives, and provide a livelihood for themselves. How difficult is that, and what sort of pressures are they facing in terms of prices?
It's extremely difficult. I was speaking to an executive from one of these big tech firms who was telling me that in the first year of the Ruto government, he lost 14% of his income to taxes. And in the second finance bill reading, he lost 20% of his income. That's somebody who's earning an incredible amount of money. So you can imagine young people who are either underemployed or unemployed, who have to, figure out a way to earn their living, who are supporting their parents. It's extremely difficult. And the taxes are going to be touching on things that they depend on: bread, sugar, vegetable oil. There's a proposed tax on content creators. This is what they depend on for sustenance. And so they're really being affected where it pinches them the most.
Now, these protests have turned horribly violent. We've seen reports that fires have been set inside of the Parliament. There are a number of people who have been reported dead. We're getting conflicting information about whether the police have just been using rubber bullets or actually live ammunition. We're told that a number of parliamentarians have had to leave their offices. We're not really sure where they've gone. Other buildings being set on fire, cars being set on fire in the streets. Why has this turned so violent at this point?
Yeah, it's an acceleration from what we saw last week, where the protests basically began. And from there, the members of Parliament, as I mentioned, did pass the first reading of the bill, essentially saying to the people, we don't care what you're saying, we're going to go ahead and do what we think is right for the nation. And so today is what is being called day 5 of 7 days of rage. This sustained campaign to make it impossible for the members of parliament to either do their work. We saw them being booed over the weekend at churches, not being allowed to speak to the masses. And so this is just a continuation of what we saw from last week and turning violent because they feel, the protesters, that the members of parliament are simply not listening to them.
What about a political voice for these young people in Kenya? Because, I mean, lots of countries have issues when it comes to the cost of living increases. We're seeing this in multiple countries, but they don't always turn into something like this, what we're witnessing right now. How difficult is that for the people to find a voice within the political system?
Extremely difficult, because at the moment, Kenya doesn't have a functioning opposition party or opposition. And so there is a vacuum there. When young people have issues, they either go online, and often the rage that happens online dissipates and it doesn't transfer offline. And so without that person to represent them in parliament, they feel that the only way out, as I mentioned, is to take to the streets.
You mentioned 7 days of rage and that this is day 5. So what can we expect in the next couple of days, Edith?
Well, tomorrow it's expected that the protesters are going to go to the police service to demand the release of people who have been arrested as a result of these protests. They're also going to be demanding justice for the people who've been killed as a result of them. And on Thursday, it's being called Total Shutdown Kenya. The idea is to close all roads leading to the capital, a call by business owners to have people not go to work. What we're seeing today, so just more of that on Thursday, assuming that they actually do make it to Thursday.
Locking of streets, labor unrest, the parliament burning. Edith Kimani, our Kenya correspondent, thank you so much.
Thank you, Terry.